Hello everyone, my name is Mary Magnuson and I work for the Blandin Foundation as Administrator of the Blandin Community Broadband Program. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this fourth in our Broadband Leadership webinar series on creating successful broadband infrastructure projects. This one is Community Broadband Surveys. We're offering these webinars to community leaders interested in learning about broadband infrastructure project planning, best practices and tips, and ultimately applying for public funds. So let's get started. Today's moderator is Bill Coleman of Community Technology Advisors, one of our primary broadband program consultants. He will set the stage for today's webinar and introduce the speakers. Take it away, Bill.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to focus on the best practices in community broadband surveys, which are really an essential part of the broadband development process. We've got a couple of speakers with us today. Doug Dawson from CCG Consulting is a nationally recognized expert in community broadband and community broadband networks and services, and helping communities move from hoping for broadband to implementing broadband. And so happy to have him here today. Nancy Hoffman is with the Chisago County HRA and EDA and has been working aggressively township by township across Chisago County to make broadband happen there with very good success. Unfortunately, Tom Johnson, who's county administrator in Nobles County, had sent his regrets this morning with some health crises in Nobles County that needed addressing. And so we're gonna miss Tom today, but they've done a great job in terms of getting input from their community and moving that towards project implementation. For those who have been with our previous webinars, you've seen my broadband process, simple version. And that's what it's all about. How do we move from poor broadband to great broadband? And we know it's a more complex process here. And this, we kind of like this new graphic, so I encourage you to download it from our Blandin site. And we know that there's a lot more arrows on this, back and forth and back to the beginning and jump forward and so on. But we think this represents a pretty good understanding of the broadband development process at the community level. And with broadband surveys, if you can see here on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, there's really a couple different purposes for broadband surveys. And really the first one, and I think Nancy's presentation reflects this, is you need to gather information to make sure that your own elected officials, your own internal audiences understand how important broadband is to community members. And maybe a need for broadband surveys later in the process when you're trying to create a provider partnership to bring them into the process and convince them that there's a strong market for broadband. Now, whether that's one survey or two, that can vary from place to place, and we're going to hear more about that today. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce Doug to take over and share his expertise. Welcome, Doug. Oh, Doug, you're muted.
Unmute. All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Very good. So I'm Doug Dawson from CCG Consulting. As Bill said, we are general telecom consultants. We've been around about 25 years now. We do everything. We do engineering, regulatory work. We've actually had a group who does surveys, which we're going to talk about today, for the full 25 years. And so we help people raise money, you name it, we do it. So we've helped literally hundreds of communities actually get a working broadband solution. And so the topics we're talking about today are near and dear to my heart because they are actually one of the most important steps of the process. So we're going to talk about data gathering and and why is my slideshow? There we go. So we're going to talk about surveys. There's different kinds of surveys. We're going to talk about canvases, which are a different kind of way of asking people what they want about broadband. We're going to talk about pledge drives, questionnaires, interviews, speeds tests, and looking at customer bills. And each one of these steps helps you understand the community broadband demand. And as Tom said, it really does have two purposes. You know, first, convincing the powers to be in the county that people really want broadband, and also then finding a partner. What we find, which is really important for all this, is that counties vary widely. We don't see the same results everywhere. We have, just in the last 2 years, have done surveys in rural areas, and you would expect rural areas to have a very high demand for broadband, and we have surveys that show a demand in the 65% range, and we've had one as high as 95%. And when it's time to go build that network, the difference between those two numbers is gigantic as far as whether you can pay for the network or not, and how much grant money you might need, and all those sort of things. So truly understanding the broadband demand in a given community is maybe one of the most important steps, because, you know, we no longer are able to do what I call build it and they will come. You really need to know up front how well you're going to do. So with that said, let's just launch in here and start talking about surveys. There's really 4 major types of methods of doing surveys, and each one of those has their pluses and minuses. The best possible way to do a survey is face-to-face, and these comments on here come from companies who have done this for a living forever and ever. So this has all been tested out by academics and sort of thing. When you look people in the eye, they tend to tell you the truth a lot more than any other way. So we know that when you know, that's one reason that a lot of survey companies have people at malls or at airports asking people questions. They tend to get the most reliable answers when you're looking straight face to face. Mail surveys are just the opposite. You have no control over who responds. The responses tend to be biased, because only people who care about that particular topic will even bother to mail the survey back. And we'll talk about all these in a little more detail in a minute. Telephone surveys turn out to almost be as good as face-to-face. It's a fast method, but nowadays, if it doesn't have cellular numbers, it's really kind of a waste of time. So you have to actually get the whole community involved. And then finally, there's web surveys, absolutely the fastest way to do it. But it's also very unscientific. Again, major bias. The results are not at all reliable in terms of trying to predict customer penetration rates. And so, but all of these have a use in certain parts of the process. And so, you know, people use all of them, and we're actually going to cover several of these methods today that were used in real practices. So let's talk about statistically valid surveys. This is the one that I have a hard time explaining to folks, because they tend not to believe it. Surveys have a very bad name because of political surveys. And interestingly, the folks that don't believe political surveys are valid oftentimes don't understand the results, because many times the results actually came back within the statistical range of results, and people go, well, so-and-so didn't win. And it's like, we said he was going to maybe win by 3%, and he lost by 2%. That was within the range of the survey. The other reason that political surveys are not so reliable is people don't always tell the truth. People may not want to tell you who they really want to vote for. They may not want to tell you how they feel on sensitive political topics. And so those sometimes are not particularly valid, just because, and that's just called plain old bias. We find that bias doesn't really exist when you ask about products and things. So we don't see bias in surveys about broadband as long as the questions aren't biased. You know, if you go, do you want to buy broadband if I can cut your rate in half? There's probably not a person in the United States who would say who would not say yes, of course I would. But that's not, you know, you're not likely to actually do that. So that's a biased question. But as long as the questions are valid, then a survey on broadband tends to be very reliable in terms of the results. What statistically valid means is that, and I go down to the next to last bullet point. If I do a survey that's 95% accurate, plus or minus 5%, what that means is I'm within 5% in that survey of the same results I would expect if I asked every single person in the county or the city. And so that's pretty darn accurate, and that gives you a pretty good clue to how people really think. And we know that these work for broadband because, as I said, my company's been doing these surveys now for almost 25 years. What we get to see is we do the survey in 1 year, and 4 years later, the mature company is up and running. We see how many customers they really got, and we can come back and compare that to the survey. And it turns out that the surveys are pretty good indicators of how a business will do in a given market. Of course, that doesn't mean that you still can't screw it up. I mean, you might, not do a good job marketing, or you might have a technical problem and make everybody mad at you. But as long as you do a good job, you should do as well as what the survey predicted. The key to a statistical valid survey is it has to be administered randomly, which means you have to touch all of the parts of the community. And so you don't, and so there's a bunch of different ways to do that. For each of those types of surveys we mentioned, there's ways that you want to do random getting to people. For instance, when we do a telephone survey, we ask for as big of a list of phone numbers we can get. We simply call every 10th or every 15th or every 20th number. We don't know who anybody is. We don't usually put names and addresses next to the numbers. They're just a list of numbers. And we just roll through the list. And once we do that, we've often mapped those, and they generally spread throughout the community very well that way. Being random is much more hard, much more difficult in a face-to-face survey. And in fact, Tom Johnson's not here today, but I helped him with the survey, and I will explain what he did because Nobles County did a face-to-face knocking on door survey, which was really a challenge. So question, again, as I said before, the questions can't be biased. And that's just a matter of experience. I've been helping to write survey questions for 25 years. After a while, you can spot a biased question quickly. And so, bias just means the question itself leads people to a certain answer, which is not what you want a question to do. So again, can be done telephone or face-to-face are the two methods that work for statistically valid surveys. If administered by telephone, it has to include cell numbers, and I'll talk about that in a lot more detail in a minute. What we normally see for most of the places that are going to want to look at broadband, be that a city or a county, you're going to normally want about 350 to 380 completed surveys. That number is very different if we're talking about a tiny community. So if you only have 1,000 homes, it's obviously not 350, but surprisingly, it still might be 250. As you get to be a smaller place, you have to talk to a pretty large percentage of the people to get a statistically valid response. So the best news about a statistically valid survey is it's the only way that we know of that you can actually predict customer penetration rates. And so that's the number one use of it. And the reason you do that is this is what ISPs love. If you go to talk to an ISP partner and you can show them the statistically valid survey, this will perk up their attention. And I'm going to actually tell you a story about that when I talk about Tom's here in a minute, but since he's not here today. But that is the number one thing. The ISPs usually have two giant questions: how much is the network going to cost, and how many customers can I get? And if you can tell them how many customers they're likely to get, it takes away a lot of their uncertainty and makes a gigantic difference to potential ISP partners. There's a lot of issues with getting telephone numbers. When I work with cities usually have a way to do it. And so, cities will, especially if they are in the water business or they just have voting lists or any number of other people who do, every time people come in and do to get a permit to add onto their room or something, if they have databases where they've gathered phone numbers for people over the years, nowadays any of those databases are likely to include a whole lot of cell numbers. And so that's very important that you get cellular numbers. And the reason for that is nowadays, if you only call people in the white pages, you're tending to call older folks, and they're more conservative, and they don't represent the whole community. They don't represent the younger folks in the community who tend not to have landlines anymore. And so, it's very important if you want to get a true picture of the whole community to not just call landline numbers. And so and working with cities, I'm very often able to get that. The other option is for cities, I'm very often able to buy a list of phone numbers, and those actually are not that expensive. For most cities, I can buy a decent list of phone numbers for $300 to $500, and that's a great way to do it too. The problem with those is sometimes they're a little biased one way or the other. They may have more landlines or more white page numbers, and you have no way of knowing when you look at a list of phone numbers anymore, because you can flop your phone numbers back and forth between a cell phone and a landline. And over the years, people do that. I still have the same cell phone number I had 30 years ago. There used to be a landline in Washington, D.C., and I've now lived in 6 different places, and I still have the same number. So the number doesn't tell you much of anything anymore. So, so one of the things we always do is we have to convince city attorneys that it's okay to give us the list of phone numbers. They go, well, you're going to violate people's privacy. And it's like, no, these are your citizens. We're doing a survey on your behalf. We're going to tell people when we call that we're calling on the city or the county's behalf. And so this is your survey that we're giving. You just happen to hire us to make the phone calls for you. And because of that, governments are absolutely allowed to survey their constituents about anything. I mean, not about broadband, about any topic whatsoever. And so most city attorneys get over that. I've had a few who just won't budge. They're completely wrong, but that's a hurdle to get over sometimes. The problem we get to is in counties, though. Counties tend to not have a good list of phone numbers. They just don't have those kind of services where they have gathered phone numbers from people. And so, a lot of times that's, we're just sitting there going, how the, so, and so without that, a good survey is really hard to do. And this is where I was going to hand the phone call off to Tom Johnson of Nobles County. But I helped him through that whole process. So let me tell you what he ended up doing. We started with this exact same question. Tom, how do we get a list of phone numbers for the county? And they just didn't have anything like that. And so, we went out to try to buy it, and anyone who knows where Nobles County is, it's very rural. There just was no list of phone numbers to be had. The only phone numbers that we could buy were for the county seat, and that's the one place that we weren't studying in the study because they already had good broadband. And so Tom really wanted to get a statistically valid survey, and so he finally said, look, if the only other way to do it is to knock on doors, then that's what we're going to do. We're going to knock on doors. It might be one of the most painful decisions he ever made because knocking on doors in a rural county is really hard. And because let's go back to the last slide, the issue is it has to be at random. And so what you do in a knocking on the door survey is sort of what you do for the telephone survey. You make a list of all the addresses, you run them through a random number generator, and you come up with a list of addresses that sort of scatter the visits all over the county. What you don't do is just go from house A to B to C to D, because you're only testing one neighborhood. And the word neighborhood is actually a funny thing, because in Nobles County, most of the people can't see their neighbors. And so going door to door in a true rural area with farms turned out to be a massive challenge for Tom. The county put together a list of, I will call them volunteers, but they really weren't, because they were all county employees that Tom sort of drafted into the survey process. And the folks went out in their evenings and weekends and started knocking on doors. They thought that this would take a couple of weeks. I think it took 3 months until they got enough surveys. It turns out that farmers are not at their house a lot. So they get to the house and nobody would answer the door. And in fact, the survey sort of started in the fall, and that's harvest season. And boy, that just really threw them for a loop. There were literally no towns in the survey for Nobles County. It was all rural areas. That's probably 80% farms. And so it turned out to be a very difficult process. Well, Tom will tell you today, and I can speak for him, that it's still the smartest thing that he did, because at that time he got one of the first, Nobles County had done their study years ago and was ready for the first set of the state Minnesota grants. And they got one of the larger grants. And the only reason they attracted a partner was that survey. That the partner was a telephone company. They were not at all convinced that they could get enough customers. But after they looked at the survey, they were convinced that they would. And it turns out that they have. That network has been built. That network has gotten more customers than was predicted by the survey. And Tom, if was on the phone today, would tell you that without the survey in his hand, he would have never talked that partner into handling the county, because that, you know, at that time, I don't remember the name of the county, but there had been one other county that year that got a big grant who turned the money back in because they did not believe they were going to get enough customers. They had not done this survey first. So you know, the survey turned out, in his case, he would tell you that was probably the most important part of the study they had done. The other important part of the study was obviously answering the second question, is how much does a network cost in Nobles County? And when he could give those two numbers to ISPs, he found a willing partner. He has one of the counties in Minnesota who now has, or will, I think the network is now finished. So it's either now finished or will be finished shortly. We'll have broadband in every single part of the county. So, I mean, this sort of got them over that hump, and so it was extremely useful. Yes.
There's a question from Swan Ray, who I know works for Minnesota Extension Service, about people when they talk about their willingness to pay for broadband and maybe paying more, or what they're willing to pay. Any feedback on how accurate people are on, you know, when it sounds good in the survey, but then when it comes time to pay an extra 20 bucks, will they pay?
Well, the answer is no. The answer is, that's the one part, back to the bias questions. When I tell you people tell you the truth, there's the things people don't tell you the truth about are numbers. We've learned for years, and we won't ask people their income level. Surveyors have found out that at least 50% of households will lie about their income level. You know, when you ask them how much money does your household make, they just won't tell the truth. People are also very leery about telling you the truth. And so what you'll get in a survey is everyone says they want to pay less. I mean, that's just normal. It doesn't mean they won't pay more, but they don't want to admit they want to pay more because they're afraid you'll use the survey results to raise the rates, right? That's a self-imposed bias by the people responding to the survey. So again, the survey is really useful for penetration rates. These surveys are not very useful for pricing issues. Honestly, they are really not useful for that. I mean, what we have found is, as long as you offer a product that's somewhere in the range of the current market rates, that you'll probably be fine. If you want to raise rates, you're taking a big chance, because a survey is not going to tell you how you will do for that. What you will find is, if you say, will you pay $20 more today? I can already tell you, years ago, we used to ask questions like that, and you only get 5 or 6 or 8% of the people saying yes. That's probably all the people who would actually do that. It turns out that part is probably true, but so that is not a very trustworthy set of answers, and that was a very good question. So. What we have found, business surveys don't work. Business surveys simply will not predict anything useful. And the reason for that is, businesses, first off, don't make snap decisions about changing broadband providers. It's a difficult decision for a business. They don't make a snap decision. If you want to give a survey to a business, you have to find what I call the broadband decision maker, and that's very often not the owner. That may be the owner's secretary. That may be 7 people who work as a committee. So you can't ask the actual people who are going to make that decision how they feel about broadband. And so a business survey does not give you any good indication of the penetration rate you're going to get. So they really don't do any good for that. And we'll talk a little bit later in my slideshow about what you do about businesses. So there are other ways to get to what you need to get to, but a valid survey is not a way to get to that answer. Finally, a canvas is a lot like a survey. It's just not scientific. It's not random. So a survey would be mailing out a survey as a canvas, putting it on the website as a canvas. Canvas just means I want to ask as many people as possible the questions about the same questions I would ask on the survey, but and so that's just called a canvas. And all that, the difference between that and the survey is it's not statistically valid. Canvases are still really useful. And what canvases can be used for is to measure sentiment. They're really useful to ask questions like, how do you feel about the current broadband providers? What you can't measure in there is things like how many people are going to buy broadband. And the reason for that is that the canvassing process is almost by definition massively biased. If you mail out a survey, people who don't care about broadband won't send it back. And that means you're going to, and so it's just important in a statistically valid survey to find the people who say, no, I'm not interested. I want to get that percentage of people who are, and in order to get that, I have to get to the percentage of people who are not. And so if only people who are interested in broadband mail back the survey, I mean, we've had mail surveys where 80, 90, 95% of the people say, absolutely, we're interested in broadband. That's not the penetration rate that they're going to find in that market. And so they're not useful for that. But the sentiment stuff is extremely useful to find out how happy are you with the current provider. And if everybody's unhappy with the current provider, I already have a really good idea that I'm going to do well, right? This is the point in the slide where I'm going to hand this off to Nancy Hoffman, and she's going to talk about her community who actually did this. They did surveys twice, and they were very happy with it. So I will stop talking and let her tell you all about it. So.
Remember to unmute, Nancy.
All right, can you hear me and see my screen? All right, just gonna move that over. All right, I'm Nancy Hoffman with the Chisago County HRA EDA, and in 2015, we became a Blandin broadband community. And I think one of the best things we did to start everything off and to get to fiber to the home was to do this broadband community survey. As I mentioned, we were a community in 2015. We had held a community meeting. So those of you who've been through the broadband community process, we started with a public meeting, and we had over 40 people there to talk about broadband and to start setting some priorities. And one of the #1 priorities was to do a survey of the county. We really didn't have a feel for who has good broadband, who doesn't, how are they using it, you know, what do we need to know from them in order to move forward. So we formed a committee that began working on this. And so we knew we wanted to get it out there. And as we just heard a bit about getting out to all people, we thought we'd give up an iPad, and that might help everybody apply. So it isn't so, or to respond. So it isn't so biased with possibly just the people that have poor broadband. We wanted to hear from everyone. We created a recognizable logo, the Got Internet, win an iPad, and we made a number of marketing materials. We had yard signs, much like you see for candidates, postcards, posters, we put newspaper ads, advertisements in, and we had many, many partners helping us spread the word. So chambers would talk about it to their chamber members. We had schools sending it out to out on their online newsletters and information that they send out to the parents. Cities are talking about it and sharing the word. And then our broadband committee was very versatile, so they were all getting it out to the organizations that they're involved with. And we did bring in a number of other partners to help us get this done. Like I said, our survey team had a variety of people. I did note that a number of them were home-based businesses in the townships. And so for their home as well as for their business, they weren't able to get broadband, and they took a special interest in it. But we also had some city members and some technology type people, the library, the chamber. We took advantage of our library system. They provided SurveyMonkey for us. They had the skills to help us put together the survey questions, as well as to put it up online. And they took all the surveys for us. We did have a paper copy available as well, because we know not everybody has good broadband. So we wanted to make sure everybody could respond. We also used our county GIS department, and they created a number of maps for us based on our survey results. And I'll show you one in a little bit. but those were very helpful as well. And then Blandin Foundation, along with everything else they did, Allie helped us with storytelling, which was so beneficial for putting our story together on what do all these survey results mean. So we did have 879 respondents, and that's out of about 20,000 households. So it could only be one from each household, and we could check that with our GIS system and weed out those that had more than one. And that gave us a 95% confidence level. So it was statistically significant, as we were just hearing about earlier. And 88.5% were from single families and 5.2 from business. And I think most of those business were more of a home-based business. 45% of the people that responded had children in school. And you can see to the right, that is one of the maps that was created, the one we probably use the most. And what this is showing is who is your provider. So the red dots are Frontier, the purple are CenturyLink, yellow is Mid-Continent, and then there were a few others, mostly satellite companies. We'd asked 20 different questions. We asked just basic household information. We needed to know the address so we could weed out duplicates. Plus we wanted to know where they were located within the county to make sure that we were getting a good broad base. Children in school, type of dwelling, how to use the internet, how many devices do you have? We'd ask questions in regards to access. If you had faster internet access, would you be doing more of the following? Most of these were multiple choice. We wanted to make it easy and fast, but a lot of them we did open it up with other comments so we could hear how they're using it. Where do you go to access the internet? A lot of people don't have it at home. And if you do not have access to service, would you be likely to subscribe? We had 93.5% of the people say yes, they would. Service information, do you have internet? Who's your internet provider? And we also, is your cell phone or mobile hotspot your only access? 9%, that seems really high to me, that almost 10% of the people are using a hotspot as their primary access to the internet. How satisfied are you with your provider? What speeds are you paying for? We did give them the link to the speed test and they would let us know. And then what are you willing to pay? And that again was a multiple choice. What are you likely to do if you had high-speed internet access? This turned out to be the question that we focused on the most, and I'll get to that in a second here. We also asked questions on cell phone connectivity. We didn't do a lot with it. We started to, but we found that a lot of the cell phone issues were being taken care of. And so it was just good for us to know. And then we'd ask people to tell us their broadband story. Over half of the people left a little story for us. And it took hours to read them, but it was so well worth it. This is where we came up with a lot of our anecdotes, our stories that we would share. You know, for instance, the realtors are saying they can't sell a house because they don't have good internet, or kids aren't able to take on their studies and they have to go to a relative's home or sit outside a building that has Wi-Fi. And so just a lot of good stories that we used. We tried to sort through them and then make sense of them. We'd asked if they'd like us to share with the provider their information, and then would you like to receive information on this initiative? A lot of what the survey ended up doing for us as well was just to get everybody talking about their internet access. I think everybody was talking to their neighbors, but we weren't coming together to talk about it as a group. And this gave them a forum to get on our Facebook and start hearing about it, give them a phone number to call. Not that we had all the answers, but at least they had a place they could call and hear about the things that we were trying to do to improve access in the county. So basically, this is what we came up with to use. We used the whole survey, but this was our number one piece. What would you do if you had faster internet? And we thought it was amazing that 35% of the people would telecommute, 45 could use it for education for their children or for college, 86% for the quality of life. We related this to the realtors that can't sell a home without internet. A lot of people, they just expect to have be able to surf the web and play games. And then for my board, being an economic development, when they said 31% of the people would use it to start a business, we thought that was just huge, and that was very helpful to get my board more involved and supportive. And so we came up with this piece that you see. This is the cover of it, used to tell our story. This is the inside. We showed our map. And I was remiss in telling you, we also used this map when we were doing the survey to make sure that we were covering our county well. And it really did. The places that are more sparse, they're either state parks or they're just very rural areas. And so we felt we really did get a good sampling of our county. And then we, the next 2 pages, we further told our story, and the last page gave credit to all the people that were involved and all the organizations involved. And so once we had our piece together, we were able to use the survey, the piece, as well as the survey results. As Bill had mentioned, we shared it with our county to get them to understand the issues in our county and get behind it and support all of our efforts. We shared it at cities, we shared it with townships, school districts, and Chamber of Commerce's, just to bring everybody on board. And we really did learn from all of them as we presented this material. We shared it with our providers as well, hoping that they would understand what people are thinking. We provided them with the whole thing, including those 480 plus comments that we got. We've used it to testify at the state legislature, as well as meeting one-on-one with our legislators. And I just found this so helpful. And when I was presenting it, to be able to be confident and sure of what I was telling the legislators, that this came from our residents and this is what they're saying. I didn't feel like I was just making it up or pulling anecdotes out. I was really taking some good information. Bill and I held a large township meeting. I think we got most of our townships there. This was after we received our first border-to-border broadband grant for Sunrise Township, and we were able to use this piece along with our experience with Sunrise to tell a story to our townships and to see if they would be interested. And it did get some of the townships interested. And we did use it for our border-to-border grant application. There's a section in there for community. And so we were able to easily plug in this information and again, feel confident about what we were saying. Since then, I think I've used up all of my surveys just recently. We do still have it on our website, and possibly we'll need to print some more out. But since then, we've done some other surveys, especially in regards to townships that were applying for the border-to-border broadband grant. Sunrise Township, they were going after a subordinated service district for bonding because it was only half of the township. And so they had to go out and basically door knock and get 50% of the people in that, it was CenturyLink's area, to sign off. So they were doing the door knocking and they got over 50% of the people to sign off. Fish Lake Township, they did a great job marketing. They were going to be providing broadband for the entire township. And so they had a survey as well, and their township board said we want at least 50% of the people to respond so that we can feel confident. And as we know, it probably didn't need to be 50% of the people, but that's what they wanted. They have a really sharp township clerk who is also a marketing person. So she sent out postcards. They already had a Facebook page up, so they were easily able to share there. And they already had a newsletter, so they shared it there. when they got, they probably got 30 or 40% of the population to fill it out through those marketing efforts. And so they also did have a committee that did go out and they door knocked and got it up over that 50% that they wanted. Chisago Lake and Franconia Township did a feasibility study working with CTC, and also CTC submitted a border-to-border broadband grant for them, and they did it through CTC. CTC had an online place where people could go for the survey, and that was mostly done through postcards, news articles in the paper, and especially Franconia already had kind of a group, a communications group for the township, so they were able to spread the word quite well, and had a very nice, I don't remember the numbers, but a very nice outcome of surveys submitted. Just one more, the city of North Branch, they they have so many different providers and cannot seem to get one to come in and really bring faster speed broadband to the area. So they did a mailed survey. They actually mailed it out with a stamped envelope so people could mail it back. This was partially paid for also through a Blandin feasibility study grant. And I should mention that as well for Chisago Lake and Franconia. So those are some assistance you can use to get these surveys done. But North Branch mapped everybody that returned a survey, and they have kind of an interactive map where you can scroll over any of the dots where somebody provided the survey back, and you can see what they have for service and what they like for service, and quite a bit of information. And it's really for the providers, so they can look at neighborhoods and potentially look at expanding their services to those areas. So another unique way of doing a survey. So again, this has been about the best thing we did to help us bring fiber to the home to a number of townships. And we continue to use it going forward as we try to get the rest of the county connected. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nancy. That's actually a really awesome explanation of ways you can use the survey. So that's why I think Tom would have told you similar things. The survey results are so useful that that they're just, I mean, that interestingly there, because they've done a number of surveys, they did them all in a different way, and they used the results in a different way, and they were all very effective. So let's see here. All right. Back to a pledge drive. One of her communities did a pledge drive. That's where you actually ask folks, are you going to sign up if we bring service? And so so that is the most effective survey. And what we have found over the years is I had a number of communities do these, and when the broadband solution came, somewhere over north of 95% of the people who say they will sign up really do sign up. So that's, I would call a pledge drive sort of the ultimate survey, because you actually go, if somebody brings this fiber or wireless or whatever to your house, will you buy it? And if they say yes, that's extremely powerful. So questionnaires, when I talked about businesses, and actually Nancy hit on this too, a questionnaire is what we recommend for business surveys, and it's exactly what she did. It asks people to tell their story. And so in a business questionnaire, we ask them the few basic things. Who's your current provider? What do you pay? What speeds do you have? But we really like them to tell us their story. What can't they do today with the lack of broadband? What could they do if they got better broadband? That tells, when you put those all together, and as she said, it takes a while to read through these, and it takes a while to sort of synthesize them down to a story for the whole county or for a whole township. But when you get them all together and you understand what all your businesses do or don't have, you get probably the most true picture of your business community, and that's a really powerful story to take to the service providers. And so we have found questionnaires which are exactly Nancy's tell us your story box to be the best way to handle business surveys. But we also very routinely put this in residential surveys and ask them to tell us their story as well. So we think that that's just a very effective tool, and it really does work. So the other thing that we always do, well, at least when people get the funding for it, we like to do some in-depth interviews. Surveys are really interesting, but sometimes you really want to talk to some people in detail, and we almost always find out a lot more facts than we would have ever found on the survey if we interview people. So we like to interview residential people and businesses. We often do this after the surveys. When we get people who sent back an interesting survey story, we go, look, this is somebody we want to ask a lot more questions of. And so we typically interview anywhere from 10 to 30 or 40 people in a community. And we've almost always found some interesting tidbits that we would not have found in any other way. The most interesting, but the thing you have to be careful about with doing interviews, a lot of people don't want their name and their story to end up in a written report. So we always say, I want to hear your story, but we give them the option of being confidential or not. And so their story may end up, part of their story may end up in a survey, but not in a way that would identify who they are. So you don't want to put people on the spot to do something they're uncomfortable with. Another sort of interview is a focus group where you pull in a bunch of people at the same time and ask questions. That is a really effective technique. It happens to be very expensive if you want to bring someone like us to town to help do it. But what a focus group will do is you get folks talking about the topic and they feed each other, and all sorts of stuff come popping out that they would have never gotten around to telling us if you didn't get them all in the same room. With a focus group, you want to put very similar people. You want to put residential people with school kids in a focus group, or you want to put small businesses in a focus group. You don't just grab people at random out of the community. You want to have sort of a homogeneous group of people that you want to know more about in detail. So the last thing to talk about is speed tests. And as Nancy said, they gave people the option on their survey to do a speed test. The speed tests are really important nowadays, and I won't spend a lot of time on this other than to say we all know that the FCC broadband maps that show what people have for speeds are pretty much, I can't even use any word other than they're pretty much total garbage in most counties. I mean, the maps come from data that are reported by ISPs. They tend to over-report the speeds. So, she talked about having counties served by both CenturyLink and Frontier, and those areas, they may say, we offer DSL up to 25 megabits. And that is the speed that it'll say on your bill. It'll say up to 25 megabits. Well, that's interesting. That's nothing to do with the real life, because rural DSL is never that fast. And what we want to know is what speeds are people really getting. And what we find when we do speed tests in rural area, and I'm sure Nancy found this, people are getting 1 megabit and 2 megabits and 3 megabits. And so that's the purpose of the speed test, is to find out how dreadful the actual broadband is. And then when you match that up with the stories they're telling you on their survey results, you all of a sudden go, now I understand why this person, their kids can't do homework at home. They're buying this product, but this product doesn't work in their household. So speed tests are very important. Nowadays, speed tests have another interesting use, and that certain grants are now allowing communities to challenge the FCC mapping data. Some don't, but some of them are allowing you to use these speed test results to go, forget what the FCC says our speeds are. Here's what our speeds really are. They've been very open to using the speed test results in the Minnesota deed grants. And so they love to see the speed test. It's a way to prove that the speeds are not what the ISPs are saying that they are. There are problems with speed tests. So you can't take them as gospel because, let's face it, speeds vary by time of day. We all know that the best speeds you get at your house are at 4 o'clock in the morning when nobody in your neighborhood is using broadband, but that's not the speed you get when you actually want to use it at 7 o'clock in the evening, right? So the time of the day is going to vary the results. If the speed test isn't taken right where it comes into the home, if it's on Wi-Fi, then you're getting a different result than the actual speed delivered to the house. My house is a perfect example. I have a long, skinny house. The broadband comes in at the front of the house up there. I'm on a Charter cable connection, we get 135 megabits per second at the front of the house. In my office, which is on the 3rd floor and at the far end of the house, I get about 30 megabits. And so my speed test you would think that I'm not getting anywhere near what we're supposed to be getting. It turns out that we actually are. So you have to take the results of the speed test with a grain of salt. However, when you take them for a whole community, you get rid of that problem. If the ISPs say that, yes, we offer 25 megabits and not one person in the community gets 25 megabits, I don't care that some of them have even slower results because of the Wi-Fi. I'm trying to prove that the 25 megabits is not the truth. And so if you get enough speed tests, you can overcome sort of these weaknesses of it. The ISPs will also claim, if you put these into a grant and challenge them, they will claim all these reasons why your speed tests are unreliable. And so the last thing on speed tests that make them really weird, most ISPs nowadays have a thing called blast technology, which means you get much faster speeds for the first 1 or 2 minutes, and then it goes very slow. Well, if you take a speed test, they usually last 30 seconds to a minute. So that looks fast. What happens is if you do something like download a giant update of a file, or you download a movie, what you'll notice is it goes fast for a minute and then it goes very, very slow and it takes forever to download. That's your real speed, and your real speed will never be captured in these speed tests. So, speed tests have their pros and cons, but if you get enough people to do them, they do tell the true story, and that's what you really want to get a hold of. So, so again, mapping speed tests, which Nancy had talked about mapping speed tests. The one thing we find out about doing that, you have to be a little careful when you start mapping them by house, because you're actually giving the ISPs the chance to look at specific customers and challenge them. If an ISP knows he's delivering a certain speed to a house, but that house has a really bad Wi-Fi modem, if you actually put them on a map where you can go, this is what this house said on the speed test, you're actually giving a challenge opportunity to an ISP to prove otherwise. So we like mapping them sort of in colors and mapping them in such a way that you don't know any individual house. You also have to worry about violating customer privacy when you get that detailed on the results. It's one thing, the way Nancy talked about, of just saying, here's who people have as their ISP provider, here's what they want. That stuff is great to map by data. We don't like mapping speed tests by household because we're actually helping the ISP challenge our results if we do that. So. The last thing that we do to sort of tell this whole story, and again, all these things that we just talked about today are gathering facts. We want to understand what's really in the community. And so we found out through surveys, we found out through canvases, all the various different ways that Nancy talked about, the different communities gathered that data. We want to gather speed tests. We want to gather those stories on the questionnaires or on the surveys where people tell us, their broadband story. Finally, we like to gather bills. Bills tell us the truth about what people really pay. That's one of those questions that is always badly represented on a survey. You go, what do you pay for broadband? They go $60. You get their bill, they're paying $90. And the reason is, they might have been quoted $60 4 years ago when they signed up for a special, but that's not what they're paying any longer. Or you ask somebody like me, and my wife pays all the bills, I'm going to just make up a number if you ask me what we pay for broadband. I honestly don't have the slightest idea. And so asking what people pay is not a very good way to get to that number. If you ask people to actually send in their bills, what we ask people to do is to rip off the corner that has their name and address on it. We just want to see what people are paying. So that's a way to find out. And the reason this is important, it's really unbelievable, but you would think companies like Frontier and CenturyLink charge the same everywhere. They do not. A lot of those decisions on what to charge people are made locally, or at least regionally, and some regions give bigger discounts and some don't give discounts. And so it's really kind of important to find out what people are really paying in your community, because that's also valuable information to the ISP to know where they can set their prices. And so that's another piece of the data gathering that we find is very important. It's the hardest one to get. People really don't want to hand me their broadband bill. A lot of times they're embarrassed about how much they pay. I do want to make a short comment on Nancy's 9% of people who use cell phone data. We see that all over the place. Unfortunately, that's true. And some of those people with students are paying $200 and $300 and $500 a month for their broadband. And we really want to know that. They really hate to tell you that, but it's really important to find out that, because there's no more powerful story to take to the politicians and stuff, to go, look, there's folks in my area paying, you know, $500 a month so their kids can do their homework. So gathering these bills is really important. So that's the end of my presentation, Bill. I think it's time for questions.
Thank you, Doug. That was great. And thank you, Nancy. I think we got great stories there. And I think a lot of great examples. So Doug, I have a question for you, not to pick on Nancy, but she claims the 95% response rate through kind of a canvas, or 95% reliability rate
Yeah,
on a canvas. And so that sounds a little contradictory there. Not that, I think the number that she got means it's pretty darn reliable, but any comment on that?
Yeah, it's really not statistically valid. So you're in that county, you're not likely to get 95% of the people to actually buy broadband. But what happens when you get a really strong response on any canvas is you just go, practically everybody's in favor of this, and that's good enough. And so you can't rely on the 95% number, but you can rely on it's really high, and that's actually good enough. And so that, you know, when you don't give it randomly, it's not statistically valid. But when you get that strong of a response, it doesn't matter because it's so good anyway. So, the answer is that was not precisely right to a math guy like me, but the answer is I would still believe her survey completely. So that's what matters. So yeah. Now if she would have gotten a 50% result, then you go like, what the heck does this mean? But she didn't. So yeah.
Great, and I think, you know, you think why you're doing this survey is to convince local officials to invest in broadband,
right,
and to attract a provider. And Nancy's one of the first few people in the world that have been able to cut a deal with CenturyLink to do fiber to the home in a rural township. So that survey must have been pretty powerful.
I was sorry that she didn't tell us that story. That was a great story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another webinar.
There we go. Fair enough.
Any other questions or comments? I've been watching the chat box, and I know Sarah Kuglin, you know, thinks this is great. Any specific questions that anyone has, or other experience you've had trying to do a survey or make use of the surveys? Okay, well, we're at 9:58, so I guess people.
Bill?
Yes.
This is Alex. I'd like to dislike Aunt Nancy, where she had several different providers that she worked with, and maybe very quickly how that worked out with several different providers being a part of this.
Yeah, that probably is the most difficult part for coming up with a plan on how to bring fiber to the home or better broadband. And that's why we ended up going township to township. Typically, there's only one provider, well, except for Sunrise, who's half CenturyLink and half Frontier, and that's why we only got half of the township done. If we only had one provider, I think it'd be a lot easier for the county as a whole to try to do something. But that's not working that way. For North Branch, sorry, my phone's ringing. For North Branch, they have CenturyLink, Frontier, they have Mid-Continent, they have some wireless options, and they're just really having a hard time, getting any one of them to do much of anything. So they're in kind of a dilemma that way.
That's probably one of the providers trying to reach you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Once you know, they call when I take it off mute.
Well, the reason I asked that question is that in Todd County, where we are, we have about 5 different providers that are doing this, and they're all at different levels of some are doing fiber, some are just high DSL. A lot of places don't have anything, so that would be the same type of situation.
Well, I think you need to find that provider that's interested. And so in some of the frontier areas in Chisago County, they've identified an alternative provider that they're working with to try and bring them in to build over the frontier network. And so that, although they didn't get funding last year for their project, but they've got multiple townships that are working together to submit an application for deed funding. So that's good. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mary, and then once we stop recording, you know, we've got our half-hour free time. If people just want to have a broadband discussion, we're ready to do that. So thanks so much, Mary.
Yeah, thank you, Bill and Nancy and Doug, for presenting today, and thanks everyone for joining us on today's webinar. On Tuesday at 9 a.m., we will continue this webinar series on creating successful broadband infrastructure projects with broadband mapping. For more information on the series and links to join, you can visit broadband.blandinfoundation.org and click on the webinars button. You can check out our Blandin on Broadband blog later today for a recap and recording of today's webinar, and we hope that you share it with your friends and colleagues. Thanks everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
And it was great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.